Welcome everyone to part 3 of my epic bodywork restoration of my 1949 AC2 Litre. If you watch the first two parts, you might be hoping all the nightmare repairs are complete. I'm afraid there's more to test one's capacity for stress. The rear shelf is a piece of birch plywood 3/8 of an inch or 9.5mm thick. It's easy to make a new one. The problem is extracting the old one, and in particular getting a new one installed. The original shelf panel is part of an assembly evidently constructed prior to adding small details such as the body sides and the roof. In fact, some of the screws securing the panel from the underside are concealed by the top of the wheel arches. It is not possible to slide the panel in and out from the front, but it can be done from the rear if the main body shell is removed. By the way, I've still not worked out why there are small cavities at each end. The ash timber at the top of each wheel arch is carefully shaped to accommodate the ends of the shelf panel. The problem of removing the old panel was reduced due to the woodworm damage. That's nice to know those pesky furniture beetles can make themselves useful. The damaged plywood was easily chiselled out, having previously made a detailed scale drawing. Then the concealed screws could be cut and filed. After cutting out the new panel, it needs some small bolt holes for a strip of timber that reinforces it, and two larger counter-drilled holes for coach bolts. They are for the fuel tank, and that large access hole is for the fuel gauge sender. Next, I dealt with repairs and new parts for the shelf assembly above the panel. Two of the curved sections were nailed on from underneath, but I prefer to use screws. I renewed one of these but made it in two parts. The tight curvature creates a weak short grain if it is made from a single piece of timber. The rear of the shelf assembly is a thin piece of plywood curved slightly. Part of this edge strip was destroyed by woodworm. Finally, gluing in the shelf panel is where it gets stressful and messy, but it went in without any setbacks. The more such repairs I did on the AC, the more rigid the whole frame felt. Just above the rear shelf there were some very minor issues with the rear window frames. The lower edges had multiple splits along the grain, which I glued down, and there were a few gaps to fill in with packing pieces. These two large corner pieces had come loose. Some more gaps to fill in the roof joints. As you can see, there are strips of soft card for the roof panelling to rest upon. I stuck some of them back down. One of the last areas to deal with was under the door steps along the sills. This is exposed to all the road spray and mud. As you can see, some of the little wooden gussets split into two because the grain runs horizontally. For the new ones I ran the grain diagonally. Seems obvious. To make those long sill rails, I finally put down my trusty hand tools and grabbed a small electric circular saw. I set its cutting depth to slightly less than the plank thickness and hand cut the last small amount. That makes it a safer process when using the power saw. One small modification was to increase the thickness of the sill rail. The original was 3/4 of an inch or 19mm square, but it was cut roughly and some of it was thinner than that. It seemed a bit flimsy and would also make it hard to hammer in panel pins later, so I increased it to about 1 inch or 25mm square, which more than doubles its bending stiffness. I made some shallow repairs to the underside of the door steps. You have to make sure that the sill panelling on the main body shell is going to fit. That includes allowance for the panel that sits upon the doorstep, which the main body shell overlaps. Also clearance at the front end for the panel to fold over close to the front wings. The wooden gussets were originally nailed diagonally, which I changed to stainless steel screws. While most of this work progressed, I had deliberately not glued on the boot side panels. That was to allow me to repaint the rear chassis and overhaul the rear axle. Once those jobs were done, I got the side panels and associated ribs permanently fixed on and painted. With the wood repairs almost all done, the frame felt as solid as granite. Test fitting those heavy doors and slamming them caused no vibrations, which it used to get. I could shake the car by its screen pillar and it felt like a single piece of metal billet. With the main body frame nice and rigid and strong, it was time to lift it off the chassis. The wood frame is bolted to the chassis with a mix of mild steel Whitworth coach bolts with square nuts and some high tensile BSF hex head bolts. Interestingly, all the coach bolts on my AC were slightly bent, consistent with a frontal crash. When I was 12 months old, my dad was driving us in the snow when he skidded into the back of a Mini. I'm told that the Mini came off worse. Before lifting the frame, I made some small jigs to help refit it very precisely. I made jigs for the sides to align the sill boards in relation to the chassis, and jigs for the rear cross member. With the car in the garage, I jacked up the centre of the rear cross member and used a pair of trolley jacks at the front corners and placed 2 axle stands under it. I did a rough calculation of the weight of the wood frame and it came to just over 100 kilograms, or about 200 weight, but it felt lighter. I could lift the rear of the frame quite easily. I could only raise the frame about 5 inches, or 12.5 centimetres, before the body shell got in the way. My first task was to make the final wood repairs. The underside of the cross member where it bolts to the chassis, then the internal parts of the sill assemblies. Also the sill boards had split ends which I reinforced. The front end was okay. I also now had access to this tubular cross member on the chassis. The tube dips under the prop shaft and dirt gets trapped there. I tied a cloth to an old TV aerial cable and gave it a clean, and then sprayed Dynatrol rust protection inside. Then I painted the wood with my usual aluminium primer and polyurethane gloss. Next task, repaint the top of the chassis and any other areas that are normally hard to access. I applied 3 coats of epoxy mastic. Next came the vexing issue of new seals to go between the chassis and timber. The original seals were similar to damp-proof course for buildings with bitumen soaked into a woven fabric, maybe asbestos, I'm not sure. The wood frame restoring library book I had consulted recommended using modern synthetic versions of builder's damp-proof course, applying silicon sealant to both sides. I noticed some major problems with this approach. The strips of damp-proof course available were very thin, only 0.5mm compared to a compressed thickness of 3mm for the original material, albeit folded over double. There are some uneven details on the chassis and a thicker seal would work better. Secondly, the new material is made of polyethylene, which almost nothing will stick to. That rather defeats the object of a seal. It also has a very poor resistance to fires. In 2013, I had a special VIP tour of the Morgan Motor Cars factory in their coach building department. I asked them what sealant they used, which was this one, but on further investigation it did not appear ideal for this application according to its makers. I decided to look into alternatives and eventually used neoprene closed cell foam. That's foam that won't soak up moisture like a sponge. Neoprene resists the weather, has some degree of fire resistance and some oil resistance. While silicone sealants don't work with it, it doesn't need any, as it tends to stick firmly to surfaces it is pressed against. I bought some 5mm thick neoprene foam with self-adhesive on one side ready to stick down onto the chassis. Note that this material is not tried and tested for this application at the time of making this video. Just to complicate matters, the rear of the frame did not use any seals. This is a great way of accelerating both rot and rust. With all the surfaces painted, that gives some protection, but water can still get into the joints, especially on the boot side panels. I found a type of silicone sealant, an expensive one, which is not acidic and permits movement in the joints. It is also interesting to note that when I temporarily bolted the boot side panels to the chassis over winter, By the following spring, the zinc-plated bolts had rusted where they touched the plywood. The acid in the wood will corrode metal, so for the final installation I coated the bolts with clear wax oil. With the rear bumper brackets fitted, a small gap to the wooden cross member was originally filled by wedging a piece of aluminium sheet folded in two. I swapped this for more of the neoprene foam. I fitted new bolts and repainted the brackets while I had easy access. For the final fitting of the wood frame, I was assisted by fellow YouTuber and regular viewer here, Napier Nimbus. Many thanks to him, as I did not want to take any chances of disaster when manhandling such a large component. As it turned out, it went on easily, and I subsequently applied more silicone sealant to the boot side panels, rather like sealing a bathroom basin. Talking of which, the sealant was so good that I used it on my shower basin. It doesn't leak like normal DIY bathroom sealants, but note that it doesn't stay nice and white and stains quickly. With the wood frame completed, apart from the doors, you might think that the biggest headaches in this body resto are over and done with. I'm afraid not. We have the panelling to deal with, including the main shell. The one part of the whole restoration that I'd been worrying about for over 20 years was refitting the shell. When I removed it in 1991, I wondered if I had destroyed my AC forever. Will the shell break when we lift it? It wasn't designed to be fitted in a single piece, so will it go back on? Will my wood repairs stop it from fitting perfectly? The large doors need a clearance of just 2 mm all the way around. There's little margin for error. What actually happened on that fateful day in 2015, when the body shell went back on, could not have been predicted. But I will describe that surreal event in the next instalment. Thanks for watching.